Hey folks, John Ferguson Smart here. I just did a keynote to a corporate client, and one of the questions that came up I thought was quite interesting, so I wanted to talk about it here. The question was, how do you avoid having, or can you have too much test automation? Can you have too much of a good thing? How do you avoid getting overlap between, say, your integration tests, your unit tests, your acceptance tests, and so forth? And the truth is, in theory, you can have too much test automation. It happens if, for instance, you are mandating a very high level of test coverage and the developers end up writing a whole lot of unit tests after the fact, or maybe you write a whole lot of acceptance tests, but often it's a unit test, which you write after the fact to test the application to build up the test coverage. And what happens is that these unit tests that get written after the fact, after the code has been built, are generally very superficial and poor quality and not very useful. And they take a lot of time. So they're not good. They're not a good use of your test automation time. But when you're talking about acceptance tests, drilling down into integration tests, unit tests, and so forth, it's a little bit of a different picture, because if you are doing what I call an outside-in development approach, where you start with your acceptance criteria and you say, right, what's the next thing we need to build? What's an example of what we need to do now? What's this business rule? How do we articulate this? And you write that in business terms, and then you automate it. And then as you drill down, what you find is that to automate your acceptance tests, you need to implement some code. And to implement the code, you need to describe the behavior of that code first. And this becomes the next layer of your test. So it might be integration tests, it might be just a straight unit test, depending on the code that you're writing. And you write that, your code that describes the behavior of the next layer down. And then as you build that layer, you might describe the layer of another component, and you say, right, what does this component need to do? That's a bit complicated. I'm going to write some tests to articulate how this bit of code behaves, what it does. Not the implementation, but what it does in terms of behavior. Because good tests test behavior. They don't test implementation. Very, very important. This is true at all levels. And so when you do this approach, what we call an outside-in approach, you work your way down into the code. Eventually, you'll get to the point where your code is trivial enough to say, well, we don't need to test all this low-level detail. We don't need to test the getters and setters or the individual fields, because we're already testing the behavior at the high level. And that's pretty much optimal. It's a very smooth transition from acceptance tests down into integration and unit tests. You don't get overlap. You don't get wasted time writing trivial tests, but you still get a very, very high test coverage. And when you use that approach, even if there is some overlap, you might have a business rule that's articulated at the acceptance test level, but also at the unit test level. You're actually describing different things. You're describing how the business rule works for the business vote. You're describing how the code level component works for developers. And that's absolutely fine, as long as you focus on describing the behavior and not the implementation. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Thanks for listening, folks.